Have no fear. Actually, I'm gonna hate on Smokey a little bit. Um, yeah, Smokey was iconic, is iconic still to this day. But Smokey's gonna get a little shade. Have no fear. Actually, I'm gonna hate on. Yeah, Smokey's gonna get some shade. So here's how it's gonna go. This week's episode is brought to you by Deep Roots Rifle Company, elevated excellence rooted in integrity and reliability. You can find them online and check out their lineup of hunting gear, apparel, and more for this fall season. Support them and support us by using code UPO10 to save on select gear from their site. You guys can find them. People are going to hate me for this one, but it's true. All right. For nearly a century, one of the most recognizable figures in American conservation has been a cartoon bear wearing a ranger hat and blue jeans. Just bare chested, get it? Pointing straight at you saying, only you can prevent wildfires. That bear, Smokey Bear, became more than just a mascot. He became the voice of how generations of Americans understood fire. If you grew up in this country, you were taught from a young age that fire in the woods is bad. It destroys habitat, it kills wildlife, it threatens homes, and it needs to be stopped as quickly as possible. And on the surface, that makes perfect sense. Nobody wants to see homes burned, forests destroyed, or lives put at risk. But what if that message, while well intentioned, wasn't the whole truth? What if it simply, what if, in simplifying the role of fire to something purely destructive, we actually lost sight of how critical fire is in the health of the land? And we've talked about that a lot on this show. And what if that misunderstanding didn't just stay in classrooms and in public service announcements, but actually shaped the way we managed forests for decades? Because when you really start digging into the history of wildfire policy in the United States, what you find is a story that's a lot more complicated than good versus bad. It's a story about fear, about reaction, about policy decisions made in the wake of disaster, and about how those decisions, combined with powerful messaging, ended up changing the landscape itself. Long before Smokey Bear ever existed, fire was already a natural and necessary part of North American ecosystem. Lightning strikes regularly ignited fires across forests, grasslands, and prairies, and those fires didn't just burn randomly, they followed patterns. In many places, especially in the Southeast and parts of the West, low intensity fires would move along the forest floor every few years, clearing out dead leaves, trimming back underbrush, and maintaining open, healthy landscapes. These weren't the kind of fires that wiped out everything. They were controlled by nature, limited by fuel, moisture, and terrain, and they played a key role in keeping ecosystems balanced. On top of that, indigenous people across North America had been using fire as a management tool for thousands of years. They set intentional burns to improve hunting grounds, encourage the growth of certain plants, and reduce pest populations, and maintain travel corridors. Fire wasn't something to fear, it was something to understand and use responsibly. It shaped the land in ways that supported both wildlife and human life. But that relationship with fire began to change as European settlement expanded across the continent. As towns grew and industries developed, forests were no longer just an ecosystem, they became resources. Timber, in particular, became incredibly valuable, and protecting that resource became a priority. At the same time, large catastrophic wildfires began to capture national attention. One of the most significant was the Great Fire of 1910, often referred to as the Big Burn, which swept across parts of Idaho, Montana, and Washington. It burned millions of acres in just a couple of days, destroying entire towns and killed dozens of people, including firefighters. It was a defining moment for the U.S. Forest Service, which was still a relatively young agency. Um, at that time, the lesson they took from it was simple and direct. Fire was a threat, and it needed to be controlled at all costs. That mindset quickly turned into policy. The Forest Service adopted an aggressive approach to fire suppression, eventually implementing what became known as the 10 a.m. policy, which aimed to have any wildfire contained or controlled by 10 a.m. the day after it was reported. Think about that for a second. Any fire, anywhere, regardless of size or conditions, was treated as a problem that needed to be eliminated immediately. There wasn't much room for nuance. There wasn't much consideration for whether a fire might actually be beneficial. The goal was total control. And for a while, it seemed like that approach was working. Firefighters got better equipment, detection improved, and more fires were being put out quickly. But at the same time, something else was happening. Something that wasn't as visible in the short term. The forests themselves were starting to change. Without those regular low intensity burns, all that material that would normally be cleared away by fire began to accumulate. Leaves, pine needles, fallen branches, dead trees, thick undergrowth, it all stayed on the forest floor. It built up. And as that fuel built up, forests that were once relatively open and easy for fire to move through in a controlled way started to become dense and overcrowded. Small trees filled in the gaps, underbrush thickened, and what you ended up with was a completely different structure than what had existed historically. It was a structure that was primed to burn, not in small, manageable fires, but in large, intense ones. But that long term consequence wasn't fully understood at the time, or at least it wasn't the priority. The priority was stopping fires. And the messaging to the public reflected that goal. By the time World War II came around, there was growing concern that wildfires could threaten timber supplies that were critical to the war effort. There were even fears that enemy attacks, particularly along the West Coast, could spark fires that could cause widespread damage. So the government decided to double down on public awareness. In 1944, the U.S. Forest Service partnered with the Ad Council to launch a nationwide fire prevention campaign, and that's when Smokey the Bear was introduced to the American public. The character was simple, memorable, and effective. A calm, authoritative figure delivering a clear message that put responsibility directly on the individual. Only you can prevent forest fires. It didn't require a deep understanding of ecology. It didn't get into the complexes of fire behavior. It was direct, personal, and easy to remember. And because of that, it worked better than almost any public service campaign before it. People paid attention. They changed their behavior, and careless campfires were reduced. Awareness of fire risk increased dramatically, and Smokey Bear became a cultural icon, appearing on posters, radio broadcast, television, and eventually just about every form of media you can think of. Generations of kids grew up learning that message in school. I did. And from a prevention standpoint, especially when it came to human caused fires, the campaign was undeniably successful. But here's where things start to get a little more complicated. Because while the intention behind Smokey Bear was to prevent careless human caused fires, the way the message was received by the public was much broader. For most people, there wasn't a distinction between a bad fire and a beneficial one. Fire was fire, and fire was something you stopped. That perception didn't just influence individuals, it reinforced the policies that were already in place. It supported the idea that suppression was always the right move, and it made it harder to introduce more nuanced approaches to fire management. Over time, even as scientists and land managers began to recognize the ecological role of fire, shifting public perception um, proved to be a challenge. Because once an idea like all fire is bad gets ingrained in a cultural level, it's not easy to undo. And that's the point where we start to see the unintended consequences of a message that, on its surface, seemed completely reasonable because ecosystems don't operate on simple slogans, they operate on balance. And when you remove a natural process like fire from that balance, the effects don't show up overnight, but they do show up. And when they do, they can be significant. As the decades went on, the gap between what the public believed about fire, and what the science was starting to show continued to widen. By the mid 20th century, researchers and ecologists were beginning to take a closer look at forests. that had experienced long term fire suppression, and what they were finding didn't line up with the idea that less fire automatically meant healthier landscapes. In many cases, it was the opposite. Forests that had once been open, diverse, and relatively resilient were becoming dense, uniform, and increasingly vulnerable to stress. You had more trees competing for the same water and nutrients, which made them weaker overall. You had thicker understory growth, which created ladder fuels that could carry fire from the ground up into the canopy. And you had a growing accumulation of dead material on the forest floor, just waiting for the right condition to ignite. At the same time, the role of fire in a maintained certain ecosystems was becoming harder to ignore. In the Southeast, for example, longleaf pine ecosystems had historically burned on a frequent basis, sometimes every 1 to 3 years. Those regular fires kept the understory open, promoted the growth of native grasses and wildflowers, and created ideal habitat for species like quail, turkey, and deer. Without fire, those ecosystems quickly began to change. Hardwoods moved in, the understory thickened, biodiversity dropped, and what had once been a fire adapted ecosystem started to lose the very characteristics that made it unique. Out west, similar patterns were emerging. Even though the fire regimens were different, in many dry ponderosa pine forests, low intensity surface fires had historically occurred every 5 to 20 years. Those fires kept tree densities low and prevented the kind of fuel buildup that leads to large, high severity events. But after decades of suppression, those same forests were now packed into small trees and heavy fuel loads, creating the conditions for fires that behaved very differently than they had in the past. And that's really the key point here. It's not just that there's more fuel, it's that the entire behavior of fire changes when the structure of the forest changes. Historically, many fires stayed on the ground. They moved relatively slowly, they cleared out what needed to be cleared out, and then burned themselves out. But in a dense, overgrown forest, fire doesn't stay on the ground. It climbs, it gets into the canopy, and it spreads faster, burns hotter, and becomes much, much harder, sometimes impossible to control. By the 1960s and 70s, this shift in understanding started to influence policy, at least within parts of the scientific and land management communities. The idea that fire could be beneficial began to gain traction, and agencies like the U.S. Forest Service and National Park Service slowly started to expand or experiment with new approaches. Prescribed burns, intentional controlled fires set under specific conditions were introduced as a way to reintroduce fire into the ecosystem that had been without it for too long. In some remote areas, managers even began allowing naturally ignited fires to burn under carefully monitored conditions, recognizing that not every fire needed to be suppressed. But while policy was starting to evolve, public perception lagged behind. Decades of messaging had done their job. People saw smoke and assumed danger. They saw flames and assumed failure. And that created a real challenge for land managers trying to do what the science was now telling them was necessary. Because prescribed burns don't always look controlled to the untrained eye. They produce smoke. They can cover large areas. And if you've been taught your whole life that fire equals destruction, it's hard to suddenly accept that some fires are not only okay, but they're essential. On top of that, there are real risks involved with using fires as a management tool. Prescribed burns have to be planned carefully. Weather conditions have to be just right. Crews need to be trained and properly equipped. And even then, there's always a chance that a fire could escape control lines and cause unintended damage. When that happens, it tends to make headlines and it reinforces public skepticism and add in concerns about air quality, especially in more populated areas. And it becomes clear why scaling up prescribed fire programs has been a slow and sometimes controversial process. Meanwhile, the consequences of long term fire suppression continue to build. As fuel loads increase and forests become more stressed, the stage is being set for larger, more intense wildfires. And when those fires did occur, they often behaved in ways that were difficult to predict and even harder to control. Fire seasons grew longer, the window of conditions that could support extreme fire behavior expanded, and suppression efforts, while still aggressive, were increasingly being pushed to their limits. Now, it's important to recognize that fire suppression itself isn't inherently wrong. When lives and property are at risk, putting fires out quickly is absolutely the right call. Nobody is arguing that we should just let fires burn unchecked through communities or critical infrastructure. The issue is that for a long time, that same suppression mindset was applied across the board, regardless of context. A remote lightning strike in a fire adapted ecosystem was treated the same way as a human caused fire threatening a town. And over time, that lack of distinction contributed to the conditions we're dealing with today. Another layer to this conversation is the role of climate. There's no question that changing climate patterns are influencing wildfire behavior. Warmer temperatures, prolonged droughts, and shifting precipitation patterns are all contributing to drier fuels and more volatile fire conditions. But focusing only on climate misses part of the picture because even in a changing climate, the way our fire behaves is still heavily influenced by the structure of the landscape it's burning through. And that structure has been shaped in large part by decades of management decisions. In other words, climate may be increasing the likelihood of fire, but fuel conditions are often determine how severe those fires are. And those fuel conditions didn't happen overnight. They're the result of long-term approach that prioritize suppression above everything else. So where does Smokey Bear fit into all of this? Again, it's not about pointing fingers at a campaign that was, in many ways, incredibly successful at reducing careless human behavior. It's about understanding how that campaign fit into a broader system. Smokey Bear didn't create fire suppression policy, he helped reinforce it. He helped embed it into public mindset, and when the public mindset and policy align, they tend to strengthen each other. That's why, even as the science began to shift, the message didn't change as quickly. Because changing a slogan is easy, changing a cultural belief that's been passed down for generations is much harder. Even today, you can see that tension playing out. On one hand, there's a growing recognition that among scientists, land managers, and even policymakers that fire needs to be a part of the landscape. On the other hand, there's still a lot of public resistance to the idea of intentionally setting fires, even under controlled conditions. That resistance can show up in the form of regulatory hurdles, legal challenges, or simply a lack of support for programs that rely on prescribed fire. And in some cases, that hesitation can have real consequences. Because the longer fuels are allowed to accumulate, the narrower the window becomes for safely reintroducing fire. Eventually, conditions can reach a point where prescribed burns are no longer feasible, and the only fire that shows up is the kind you don't want, the kind that burns out of control under extreme conditions. That's the part of what makes this such a complex issue. There's no easy fix. You can't just flip a switch and return forests to the way they were 100 years ago. There's too much buildup, too much development, and too many variables at play. But what you can do is start to shift the approach. You can start to recognize that not all fire is the same. You can begin to use the tools that we now know are effective, including prescribed burns, mechanical thinning, and in some cases, allowing natural fires to play their ecological role under the right conditions. And just as importantly, you can start to shift the conversation because if the public understanding of fire doesn't evolve, it's going to be difficult to implement the kinds of management strategies that are needed moving forward. That means rethinking the way we talk about fire, not as something that's purely destructive, but as something that, when managed correctly, can be restorative. It means acknowledging the role that indigenous fire stewardship has played for thousands of years and incorporating that knowledge into modern practices. And it means being honest about the fact that some of the challenges we're facing today are the result of past decisions that at the time seemed like the right call. And what brings us to where we are now? That brings a point where the conversation around fire is starting to change, but the landscape is still dealing with the legacy of how we got here. And that legacy shows up every single fire season. You see it in the size of the fires, the intensity, the speed at which they move, and the impact they leave behind. Fires today, especially in certain parts of the country, aren't just burning brush and understory the way they historically did. They're burning entire stands of timber. They're scorching soil to the point where it can't absorb water, and they're reshaping landscapes in ways that take decades, sometimes generations, to recover from. And when that happens, it's not just a forest issue. It becomes a watershed issue, a wildlife issue, a human safety issue, and an economic issue all at the same time. One of the biggest differences between historical fire patterns and what we're seeing now is severity. Not just how often fires occur, but how intensely they burn. In many fire adapted ecosystems, low to moderate intensity fires were the norm. They cleared out fuels, recycled nutrients, and left the larger trees mostly intact. But when you introduce decades of fuel accumulation into that system, you create a condition for high severity that fires that don't just clean up the forest floor, but fundamentally alter the structure of the ecosystem. When a fire burns that hot, it can kill mature trees that would have otherwise survived. It can eliminate seed sources, it can change soil chemistry, and in some cases, it can push an ecosystem past the tipping point where it doesn't come back in the same way it was before. Forests can convert to shrubland, grasslands can be overtaken by invasive species, and the long term trajectory of that land shifts, and not always in a way that benefits wildlife or people. Now, layer on top of that the fact that more and more people are living in what's called the wildland urban interface, areas where homes and communities are built right up against or within fire prone landscapes. That creates a situation where fire management isn't just about ecology anymore, it's about protecting lives and property, and that raises the stakes significantly. Because once homes are in the picture, the tolerance for letting fire play its natural role drops dramatically. This is where things really start to collide. On one hand, the science is telling us that the fire is necessary, that it needs to be part of the system, and that reintroducing it in a controlled way can reduce the risk of catastrophic events down the line. And on the other hand, you've got communities that understandably don't want any fire anywhere near them. You've got smoke concerns, insurance concerns, liability concerns, and political pressure that all push decision makers toward the safest short term option, which is often suppression. Again, that's not an unreasonable response. If a fire is threatening homes, you put it out, no questions. But when that same mindset is applied everywhere all the time, it continues a cycle that got us here in the first place. Fuels keep building, forests stay dense, and then when conditions line up for a fire to start, it has everything it needs to become a major event. This is where the conversation around good fire versus bad fire becomes so important because not all fire carries the same level of risk, and not all fire produces the same outcomes. A prescribed burn conducted under the right conditions with trained crews and proper planning is fundamentally different from a wind driven wildfire burning through heavy fuels during a drought. But if the public perception lumps those two things together, it becomes much harder to use the tool that could actually reduce the risk of a more dangerous one. There's also a timing element to this that often gets overlooked. The best time to deal with fuel buildup is before it becomes extreme. That requires being proactive, not reactive. It requires investing in management strategies that don't always produce immediate visible results, but pay off over time by reducing risk. And that's a harder sell, both politically and publicly, especially when budgets are tight and attention tends to focus on immediate threats rather than long-term prevention. Another piece of this puzzle is mechanical thinning, physically removing smaller trees and excess vegetation to reduce fuel loads. In many areas, especially where fuels have become too dense for safe prescribed burning, thinning is a necessary first step. It can help restore more natural forest structure and make it possible to reintroduce fire in a controlled way later on. But like prescribed burns, thinning comes with its own set of challenges, including cost, access, environmental concerns, and public perception. All of these factors, fuel buildup, changing climate and conditions, expanding development, and even evolving management strategies, are part of the modern wildfire equation. And when you step back and look at the big picture, it becomes clear that there's no single cause, no single solution, and it's a complex system with a lot of moving parts. But that doesn't mean we can't learn from the past. Because one of the biggest lessons in all of this is that well intentioned actions can have unintended consequences. Excuse me. When they're applied too broadly or without a full understanding of how the systems actually work. The fire suppression policies of the 20th century were driven by a desire to protect resources and lives. The Smokey Bear campaign was designed to reduce careless human behavior, and in many ways, both of those efforts achieved their goals. But at the same time, they contributed to a shift in how we think about fire, one that removed an important ecological process from the landscape and replaced it with a mindset of total exclusion. And now, decades later, we're working to reintroduce that process under much more complicated conditions. That's not an easy task. It requires coordination across agencies, cooperation from the public, and a willingness to accept some level of short term risk in order to reduce long term danger. It also requires education, helping people understand that seeing smoke in the distance isn't always a sign of something going wrong. Sometimes it's a sign that something is being done right. And that brings us back to Smokey Bear. Because even today, Smokey is still out there, still delivering a version of that original message. The slogan has been updated over time, shifting from forest fires to wildfires to better reflect the broader range of fire environments. But the core idea remains focused on prevention. And to be clear, preventing human caused wildfires is still incredibly important. A large percentage of wildfires in the United States are started by people. Whether it's unattended campfires, discarded cigarettes, equipment use, or other preventable actions, reducing those ignitions is a critical piece of the overall strategy. But prevention alone isn't enough. Because even if you could eliminate every single human caused ignition tomorrow, you'd still have lightning, you'd still have dry fuels, and you'd still have landscapes that in many places are primed to burn. So the conversation has to go beyond prevention. It has to include management. It has to include restoration. And it has to include a more nuanced understanding of a fire's role in the environment. That's where the message needs to evolve. Not by abandoning what Smokey Bear represents, but by building on it, by adding context, by making room for the idea that while some fires should absolutely be prevented, others should be allowed or even intentionally set under the right conditions. Because at the end of the day, fire is not something we can eliminate from the landscape. It's been here long before us, and it will be here long after us. The question is how we choose to deal with it. Do we continue to treat it as an enemy in all situations, reacting to it only when it becomes a threat? Or do we start to see it as a tool, one that, when used responsibly, can actually help us create healthier, more resilient landscapes? The shift in perspective is already happening in some places. You're seeing more prescribed fire programs, more collaboration with indigenous fire practitioners, and more research into how different ecosystems respond to fire under different conditions, and more efforts to educate the public about why all of this matters. Because, but there's still a long way to go. Because changing that system that's been in place for over a century doesn't happen overnight. And changing the way people think about something as powerful as potentially as dangerous as fire takes time, trust, and consistent messaging. That's what this comes down to. Not whether Smokey Bear was right or wrong, but whether we're willing to update the story we've been telling ourselves about fire. Because the reality is fire has always been part of the system. We just forgot how to live with it. And now we're having to relearn that lesson on the fly, under pressure, and with a lot more at stake. So maybe the message moving forward isn't about prevention. Maybe it's about responsibility in a broader sense, understanding when to stop a fire and understanding when to use one, and understanding that the health of our forest and safety of the people who live around them depends on getting that balance right. Because fire, whether you like it or not, is part of the landscape. And the sooner we start treating it that way, the better off we're going to be. That's all there is to it. I mean, we see these fires all over the Southeast right now, and it's not good. They're way bigger than you want to see a control fire, and they're getting in and destroying people's homes. We don't want to see that. Um, and I hope this rain we just got yesterday provided some help. I haven't looked any updates on some of the fires across South Georgia right now, but I hope they got some of that rain too. We all need it, but the wetter season is coming, so we'll see how it goes. Fire's part of it. It was here before us. Like I said, it'll be here long after us. It'll be here next week when we do another one of these shows. Until then, we'll catch you later.